right, good to see everyone tonight. It is time to begin. And before we get started, our main focus tonight will be chapter 3. We need to pick up the pace a little bit because we still have to study Colossians. We can't just spend all of our time in Philippians, although I think we could probably pretty easily do that. So before we get into the rest of chapter 2 that I want to cover, I want to remind you of a couple of things. So try to summarize as best we can, because I know we have some people who aren't able to attend every class that we've had so far. And then, of course, I think for all of us, maybe we need a reminder or two about where we've been. So this is how I summarize where we've been so far. Paul thinks his imprisonment is good despite his opponents. Remember that we talked about in chapter 1 how he viewed his imprisonment as a good thing. Even though there are these preachers apparently that are coming in, they're preaching Christ in his absence, and in some way they did it to afflict him. And what does Paul say? He says, well, it doesn't matter. The gospel's being preached. That's the thing that matters. And so he rejoices in that. In chapter 2, the way to summarize those first two verses, at least for me, has been, or is, he encourages the church to be selfless. And remember, that's when he's talking about being of the same mind. And we talked a lot about that because that is a very practical passage. And we said that doesn't mean you agree on everything all the time. What it means is you have the same goal, you have the same emphasis, and therefore you have the same attitude toward each other, even when you're talking about some very important subjects. And he ends that, but really, of course, this is the main point, is that they should have the mind of Christ. And then he further emphasizes that in the hymn of Christ that we talked about last week. And hopefully we got from that hymn, that's really the main point. I mean, there are several very interesting and frankly difficult matters in that hymn, but overall, that's what he's trying to do with that hymn. All right, so let's finish up chapter 2. We're not going to look at everything in chapter 2, but because there are some biographical or autobiographical material, I guess we should say, at the end, and so I'll mention them in passing. But before we get into that, let's read 14 through 18. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Actually, let's stop there, and then we'll read 17 and 18. So 15 and 16, or actually, I'm sorry, 14, 15, and 16, it's all one sentence. Okay? So to really get at what he's saying, I think we need to do a little bit of grammatical deconstruction, if you will. I know this isn't a grammar class, but can anybody tell me the main verb in those first three verses up here? What is the main verb in the main clause? Anybody know? Yeah, good. Exactly. It's do. What kind of word is that? Well, it's a verb. It's a command. It's an imperative. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. That's the main sentence. But I think it gets a lot more interesting, of course, when we keep reading. Because, I mean, that has enough to think about, and we'll get to that. But look at how this works, all right? Why do you do all things without grumbling or disputing? So that, you notice I have all that emboldened. That's not a mistake. I mean, my slides have mistakes on them, okay, as you know. But that's not a mistake. I wanted to include so that you might be able to see how this works grammatically. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. Why? So that you may be blameless and innocent. Okay? Children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. All that's descriptive of being blameless and innocent. You can't be, in other words, you can't be blameless and innocent without grumbling, or unless you are without grumbling or disputing. And you can't be blameless and innocent, or if you're blameless and innocent, then you stand out in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, but you also shine as lights in the world. But again, there's another description that you're holding fast the word of life. And then he adds in his own implication, or implication for himself, I should say. All right. I hope that makes sense. I probably didn't explain that well. But this is one of those passages that surprised me. Because when we see that concept, lights in the world, we think about doing the big things, right? And avoiding the big sins. We are lights in the world because obviously we don't murder people. We don't commit adultery. We don't steal. You know, all those big sins. Is that how he describes being lights in the world here? No, it's not. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Should we raise our hands if we've grumbled or disputed? Well, I don't think we have to do that. Okay, and I hope I'm right in that, because that made me feel better. It would maybe not. I wouldn't feel so great if I was wrong in thinking that everybody's grumbled or caused some sort of dispute at some point or another. But he says, do all things without that. And if you do all things without that, you're going to be lights in the world. What does that say about Paul's view? And of course, it's a correct view of humanity. People grumble and complain and cause problems. And he says, you can stand out. Or rather, you can impact people for positive things when you don't do that. This is one of those passages that not only is it surprising, but it's also so pertinent to humans at any point, right? We have a tendency to think that we have come so far, and you know what? We have. Technologically, there was this book, I can never remember this guy's name. Kurzweil, I think is the guy's name. He wrote a book a few years ago, and basically what he argues is that when you look at the increase in computer power every year, that is sort of a barometer for how much further we can go with technology. And of course, it's pretty open-ended. But what he essentially says, and I think we would be hard to dispute this. It would be hard for us to dispute this. He says, we have advanced technologically more in the past, I think, 4 or 5 decades than all of human history combined. Technologically. That is astounding. And so we are on the back end of that. We've lived through that. And so it's easy to think, well, you know, humans aren't the same. Yeah, they are. In Paul's day, people grumbled and people complained and people caused disputes, and people still do it today. But if I don't and if you don't, we're going to be different than other people around us. That's one way to be different. And again, we're not being different to be different. That's not the point. The point is your allegiance to Christ makes you different. It's not that you're going out of your way to try to stand out from society. That's not the point. The point is your allegiance to Christ causes your differences to be seen by other people, and other people can say, you know what? What is different about that person? He doesn't complain. He doesn't grumble. That's what we want. I don't know about you, but we've probably all been around people who are characteristically grumbling and complaining. And I'll tell you what, I'm dead serious about this. If somebody thinks that about me, tell me, because I don't want to do that anymore. I really don't. I'm not kidding. This isn't a gimmick. I'm serious. If somebody thinks, oh, there's that Will guy, man, he's always complaining. No, I don't want to be like that. I really don't. Because I take this passage seriously, and we should all do it. Now, it is worth asking, though, Did Paul have something specific in mind that they're grumbling about? Maybe they're grumbling about Paul. Where is he? How did he get arrested? Maybe they're grumbling about God. How could God let him get arrested? He's supposed to be helping us, and he's in prison. Both of those are possible. We don't have any idea. And in fact, here is one of those places in Scripture where I think it's almost good that we don't know the specifics, because we can apply it much more easily, I think, when it's more general like this. It's like Proverbs, for example. We don't know the exact situations behind those Proverbs, but they're general enough that I think we can apply them, right? So, anyway, that's how we become blameless and innocent. That's not all there is to it. It's not all there is to it when we shine His lights in the world, but it is part of it. But let's dissect this a little bit further, and we can move on, and hopefully what I've said has been beneficial, but let's stop and let's ask a very simple but difficult question, which I think Scripture frequently confronts us with, by the way, those sorts of questions. Here's another one. Why do we complain? Let's just start there. Why do we grumble? Why do we complain? Anybody know?
It's all about us.
Okay.
If anything doesn't go our way, or if something happens and it's not what we think we should do or they should do, so it's very much a perspective. Selfish.
Yep, exactly. I don't know if I'm willing to go as far to say all sin is rooted in selfishness, but nearly all of it is. Maybe all of it is, but nearly all of it is, and so is this, I think. What were you going to say? Perspective. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It has to do with perspective and expectation of how you think things ought to be, right? If you think everything ought to go your way, you're going to have a hard time in this life, right? And that's what we try to teach our kids constantly. Things aren't always going to be fair. Things aren't always going to be good. In fact, a lot of the time, they're not going to be that way. And the quicker we get them to learn that, maybe the easier time they'll have, right? But it all again, perspective or expectation of how things are supposed to be. When they don't turn out that way, we're disappointed. So, one philosophy we could have is just have zero expectation for anything. Let's try that for a while. That's not easy, by the way. Yeah.
I don't think what Paul is saying is we should not have or take issue with something.
Okay.
But what he's saying is how we address our issue with something or something does matter.
Yep.
Grumbling is not a way to do it.
Yep.
When you look at the Old Testament about the murmuring and the grumbling,
Yeah.
people in the Old Testament did, God did not look very highly. It wasn't that those people did not have an issue, but the way they went about it
Yep.
was completely opposite of what God would have us do. If we've got an issue with a brother, instead of grumbling about it, go to brother.
Yep.
Or if we've got an issue with, you name it.
Yeah.
How we deal with it speaks very highly to our own integrity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good reminder in this discussion. He's not saying never take issue. In fact, if we go back to the beginning of chapter 2, I think it's how to deal with people when you have issues with them. It's being of the same mind, having the same love, etc. So yeah, I think that's a very good caveat as well. Anything else about that? Okay. Well, continuing on, he says, holding fast the word of life, so in the day of Christ, again, that's that eschatological orientation that we talked about before. And then he uses two images here, one of which is from athletics, which is very common for Paul, as you probably know. And then the other one has to do with just working in general, and perhaps it has to do with his profession. Labor in vain. You can just imagine Paul here thinking about someone, and we say, well, he's a tent maker or whatever, right? Well, yeah, he did, but he probably made other sorts of leather goods. So let's just assume somebody orders something and he's making it, and about halfway through he realizes it's not the right proportion, or he's cut it wrong somehow. Well, he just labored in vain, right? He's got to start over. That may be the idea he's got in mind. The first one, as I said, is athletic imagery, that he runs in vain, right? You've run this race, and then at the very end you realize, in the language of 1 Corinthians, disqualified or you lose, right? I always think about the Olympics, and I'm not a huge Olympic fan, but these people work, in some of the competitions, they work for their entire lives for this one moment that lasts a handful of seconds, and they lose. And for some of them, that's the only chance they'll ever have because of certain circumstances, right? Well, did they run in vain? Well, if their objective was to win, yeah, they kind of did. Now, of course, I'm sure they learned lessons along the way. They're in great shape, etc. But they went there to win. They didn't win. Okay, so again, that's the imagery he's using here. And he says, so he wants them all to do that so that in the day of Christ I may be proud. So it has something to do with Paul's effort too. This sentence, we can spend the rest of the time on it. We need to move on. And then he mentions in verse 17, even if I'm to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with you all. Again, I think that has to do metaphorically, of course, with his death. And he says, likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. Okay, so chapter 2 after this has to do with, chapter 2 after this has to do with a message about Timothy. He wants to send Timothy to them very quickly. And then he also mentions Epaphroditus, who we learned from that passage, he was very sick. And they knew about it. He survived. He wants to send him too. So that's basically what the rest of chapter 2 concerns. So we do need to move on to chapter 3. I want to remind you, though, of the 3 problems in Philippi. I've said this repeatedly, but I want to say it again. We constantly think about Philippi and characterize it with one word, that's joy, right? And because Paul mentions it so many times. And it may lead us to think that Paul just wrote to the Philippians because he loved them. It wasn't because they had any problems. It's not like Corinth or something. Well, they don't have the problems that Corinth did, but they did have some problems. We talked about this already today. Fellow Christians oppose Paul. We talked last time, and we'll talk about it again probably next week, that some members of the congregation weren't getting along. Chapter 4 and chapter 2. But tonight, in chapter 3, we're talking about Jews or Jewish Christian missionaries. We don't know which it is, but it doesn't really matter that much because what we're talking about here is the biggest problem in the early church. And I don't say that lightly, but if you had to answer the question, what was the biggest problem in the early church? It's this one. Did Gentiles have to obey the law of Moses? And this question is rooted in, of course, the origins of Christianity. Jesus was Jewish. Jesus' immediate disciples were Jewish. Most of the early disciples were Jewish. But then, of course, we have it in Acts 10 where the Gentiles received the gospel. What now? What do they do? Then we have Acts 15. But we don't just have Acts 15. We have 2 epistles, entire epistles, written, almost entire epistles written about this subject, Galatians and Romans. Galatians and Romans cover a lot of the same ground. They're not exactly the same, but they have a lot of the same ground. They have a lot of the same arguments. But it's the big problem. And then, of course, we have it in Philippians 3. Although whatever's going on in Philippians 3 isn't quite the same as what's happening in Galatians and Romans. Okay, it's not quite the same. In Galatians and Romans, the issue seems to be that some Jewish Christians were trying to convince the Gentile Christians that you need to keep the law of Moses because it can provide justification. The works of the Mosaic law can provide justification. Paul says, no, it can't. It can't do that. Justification comes through faith in Jesus Christ, not through works of the law. Repeatedly making that point in various ways in Galatians and Romans. As I said, Philippians 3 is a little different. I think in Philippians 3, the threat is there, but maybe it's not as serious or as immediate. Immediate's a better word. As immediate as it is in Galatians and Romans, because he doesn't spend that much time on it in Philippians 3. On the other hand, his demeanor toward this problem in Philippians 3 is much more aggressive, I guess we could say, than Romans, not so Galatians, but in Romans it is, or it is rather than in comparison to Romans. Really, it's a question of identity. And the identity part, what I'm saying is, what does it mean to be a Christian? What are the marks of a Christian early on? And of course, are these important questions today? Yes, of course they are. We may not be talking to people or thinking about people that are Jewish, so it may not be that sort of predicament. But we still deal with questions of identity all the time, right? We just talked about identity in the passage I just read, or we just talked about, right? So again, this is a question of identity as well. All right, so I guess I should say, any questions about that before we get into this? Okay, well, notice how I've divided verse 1 and then the rest of it. That's on purpose. And a lot of translations will do this too. They will divide it. And they don't, and by the way, translations typically don't do this because that's what it is, like in Greek or something, the Greek manuscripts. That's not it. It's because they see that something's going on here because the tone is so different. You have these abrupt tonal shifts very rarely in Paul. One of the other occasions that's easy to see is when you go from 2 Corinthians 9 to 2 Corinthians 10. You think, what in the world happened? The tone completely shifts as it does here. All right? And notice how this verse begins. Finally. Now, some translations try to do something else with that phrase. But most of the time you see it in the New Testament, in Paul, it's finally. So I think we should go with finally. Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you is no trouble to me and is safe for you. Sounds like he's about to wrap it up, right? But then we have look out, and really beware is maybe a better translation. Beware of the dogs. Beware of the evildoers. Beware for those who mutilate the flesh. Wait a minute. Where did this come from? Not only does this not match the tone of verse 1, this doesn't match the tone anywhere else in Philippians. It's so striking and jarring that some scholars have posited that there's more than one letter here. You got Philippians 1:1 through 3:1, and then we got another letter here. There's absolutely no manuscript evidence for that, so it's an argument from silence as far as that goes. However, there are some curious things, some curious evidence from early Christian texts, not the New Testament. So, for example, there's a canon list that mentions the letters, plural, to the Philippians. And there's one other piece of evidence, too, that says the letters to the Philippians. I don't know what that means exactly. Let me be very clear. I don't think this is two letters. Again, I think that would be reflected in the manuscript tradition. This is not there. So I don't think that's a very good argument. But I mean, we do have to explain this somehow. And the way I explain this is pretty much the same as I explain 2 Corinthians 9 and the break before 10. And that is, Paul, maybe he intended to finish in verse 1. And so he stopped writing. You know, he had other things to do, even though he's in prison. He had other stuff to do, and other things to think about, right? So maybe he left it for a minute or for a while, and then somebody comes back and he says, hey, did you hear about what happened at Philippi? There are these Jewish teachers or Jewish Christian teachers. They're trying to pull the same stuff they pulled in Galatia and Rome. And he's like, all right, let me put an end to that. And so he doesn't even bother to connect verses 1 and 2. He just starts the argument. To me, it's an argument from silence, but to me, that's a stronger argument than thinking these are two letters. Okay, so again, did I even have to bring that up? Not really, but I think we can explain things like that in a setting like this because those ideas are out there, and so I think it's worth knowing why some scholars would argue that. All right, let's go back to the content, which is what we're more interested in. Again, beware of the dogs, beware of the evildoers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. All right? If you just had verse 2, you may think, what in the world is he talking about? Verse 3, he makes it pretty clear. For we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. We'll stop there, even though he continues that argument. We are the circumcision. Well, that helps us understand those who mutilate the flesh, and it also helps us understand the dogs, right? Which is a term that you can see this in the New Testament in at least one place. It's a term that apparently Jews use to talk about Gentiles. Well, what Paul does here is he just turns it back on them. He says, actually, you're the dogs, okay, because of the way, I'm assuming he would say, the way you're acting or the way you're thinking, right? I think that's what he's doing. He says, we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. So what he's talking about mutilating the flesh, he's talking about circumcision. And Paul talks about circumcision maybe more than you would think. And so it's the question of why does he mention that specifically versus some other things that differentiated the Jews from other people. And I think what it is, circumcision became an argument of pride. But it also signified the entire Mosaic law that differentiated the Jews from everybody else. And so when he says circumcision, he just means the law. This is a symbol for all of it, I think, is what he's saying. So he says, we put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. All right, now let's stop here. A couple of things. Rhetorically, I've talked about this before. We should never lose sight of the fact that Paul is trying to do certain things rhetorically above all. And what I mean by that is, Paul will say certain things in his remarks rhetorically, and he doesn't have to explain it. And in fact, it didn't even occur to him, I think, when he's writing some of these things, oh yeah, I should probably clarify that. No, he doesn't have to do that every time. It's like a preacher, right? A preacher gets up, he says something, and maybe sometimes we're thinking, wait a minute, what does he mean by that? Why didn't he address that? Because it's not the point. Right? Have you ever heard a preacher say something and you thought, man, what does that mean? And maybe you ask him about it afterward and you say, did you mean this? He's like, no, I didn't mean that. It's because he did. You don't have time to clarify everything you ever say, right? We'd never get anywhere. Never get anything done. Okay, so again, let's remember that. And I say that specifically about verse 6, the end of it in particular. All right, so let's remember that. But let's also remember what he's doing rhetorically. So in other words, remember that he's doing something rhetorically, and then also remember what it is he's actually doing, if that makes any sense. Maybe it doesn't make any sense, but it does up here. That's all that matters. No, that's not all that matters. Okay, let's just get on with it, and then maybe it'll make sense. He says, I have more reason to have confidence in the flesh. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. That's the part that has caused so many problems. Because when we look at what Paul says elsewhere about the law generally, like in Galatians and Romans, but we also think about what he says about himself with regard to the law, like in Romans 7, which for a long time people interpreted as being some sort of autobiographical statement of Paul, which I don't think it is, but I'm here to admit, for me, it's a very difficult passage. In fact, I think maybe it's the most difficult in Romans 7. I'm just not sure how to handle it. But even if we assume it's autobiographical, how can he say, under the law, blameless? And I think what he's doing here is he's saying from the perspective of these Jewish teachers and Jewish Christians, when you look at all my credentials, I was to the law blameless. It's irrelevant what Paul actually thought of himself. That's not the point. He's saying if I'm gonna boast, I've got stuff to boast about. I've got stuff to brag about. So, all right, that's hopefully the first question, is to, let's not make too much of that, is what I'm trying to say. But then, why is he doing this? Verse 7. All that stuff that's so important to you, all those qualifications that are important not just to these teachers, but important to people of Israel. He says, I count it as loss for the sake of Christ. Now, this is not light for him to say this. And I want us to look at one specific thing that he says and unpack it a little bit more to see what exactly he's counting as loss. What does it mean in terms of his reputation, for example, when he says a Pharisee? Well, who were the Pharisees? Well, I think a lot of times we have a very narrow view of the Pharisees because of the ones we meet in the New Testament. But let me ask you, Matthew 23, Jesus denounces the Pharisees very severely. And if we had to summarize the Pharisees in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in one word, it might be hypocrisy. Okay? That's clear. So in other words, were there Pharisees who were hypocritical? Absolutely there were. Were there any good Pharisees mentioned in the Gospels? Anybody know? Yep, there were. But when we realize that if Josephus is at all correct, and by the way, in his life, his autobiography, Josephus says he was a Pharisee for a while. So if we can believe anything he says, which I think we can, by the way, there were over 6,000 Pharisees. So Jesus is just dealing with a handful of them. He's not dealing with all 6,000 of them, right? But again, even the New Testament reminds us, let's not characterize all the Pharisees this way, okay? Because there are over 6,000 of them. So what did they believe generally? They believed in the written Torah and the oral Torah. What's Torah? Well, that word is translated into Greek as law. Does it include the law? Yeah, it does. But it also includes more than that. It has to do with covenant as well. And it's used in different ways. It's used to talk about the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. But also it includes, as I said, this oral Torah. We even have this alluded to in the New Testament, I think, when it refers to the traditions of the fathers. So when Paul says he's a Pharisee, he's somebody who believed in those things, not just the written Torah, but the oral Torah. By the way, there are Jews today who still take that very seriously. They believe that on Mount Sinai, Moses received the written Torah. That's what's in the Pentateuch. But he also received the oral Torah, which was passed down from generation to generation, and that's what you have in the rabbinic text, the Mishnah, and the Talmud right now. Okay, so it's still preserved. Some Jews take that very seriously. They believe it. There are other Jews who take the Mishnah and the Talmud very seriously, but they don't necessarily believe that. Okay, it's a different process that they believe took place for that. But anyway, that's the classical understanding of, I guess you could say, the traditional understanding. They believed in the resurrection. They believed in final judgment. They believed in angels. So there are a lot of things the Pharisees believed that we see reflected in the New Testament as well. Something else that Paul doesn't mention here, but he mentions in Acts 23, I think, that Gamaliel was his teacher. Do we know anything about Gamaliel from rabbinic sources? Yeah, we do. He died in 52 AD, and this is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a rabbinic text that's codified about 200 AD. And it says, when Gamaliel died, the honor of the Torah ceased, and purity and piety became extinct. Now again, you want to talk about rhetoric. Okay, they don't mean this literally, of course. They don't mean this literally. But to even say it rhetorically, what does that say about Gamaliel? And Paul is his most well-known disciple. So when Paul says, I'm a Pharisee, all that is included. And then he says, you know what, all that doesn't mean anything because I've gained Christ. He continues on with that argument. He says, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For His sake I've suffered the loss of all things and count them as crap. Yeah, that's not a misprint. I'll explain that in a minute. In order that I may gain Christ and be found in Him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Jesus Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know Him and the power of His resurrection and may share His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death. So notice 8, 9, and 10. It's all one sentence, right? He says, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. All that stuff I just mentioned that would have impressed any Jew, especially, it sounds like, the ones that were somehow infiltrating the Philippians, they would have been very impressed by that. And he says, you know what, this doesn't mean anything. And he says, for his sake, I've suffered the loss of all things. And not only that, not only have I lost them, they're not worth anything. But he goes further than that. And this word that I've translated crap here, yes, I did it that way because that's a crude word. This is a crude word in Greek. Okay, some translations say rubbish. No, come on. Okay, I mean, unless we're trying to sound hoity-toity, we don't say rubbish, right? I say it occasionally. But anyway, no, we don't use that word, right? This is supposed to be shocking. One commentary says something else. I didn't think it was a great idea to put that up here, okay? So, and you know, it's hard to translate it. But in Greek, it's used to talk about like trash. It's also used to talk about dung, human dung sometimes, all right? So just nasty stuff, right? So it's not just that it's rubbish. It's not worth anything. It's not worth anything, and it's disgusting. That's the point. It's utterly pointless. It's useless, even though some people look at it and they say, man, that is really impressive. He says, doesn't matter. It's not worth anything. It's disgusting. Why? So that I may gain Christ and be found in Him. And then I think he shows us His hand with regard to what he said earlier about being blameless in the law. He says, I don't have a righteousness of my own from the law. So you see, he's already, I think, defeated that idea that we mentioned a little bit earlier. If we take him seriously, does he really mean he's blameless in the law? No, I don't think he did. From their perspective, that's what they would have said. But from his perspective, he says, that's not my own righteousness. That's the righteousness that comes through faith in Christ. The righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know Him in the power of His resurrection, may share in His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death. All right? Why don't we stop there, and then we'll pick this up next Wednesday, because obviously we can't leave the passage like that. The things he says here are extremely powerful. So let's do justice to that, or try to, next Wednesday. Thank you.